Despite its small appearance, MSI's low-profile variant of the GTX 1050 Ti performs the same, if not better, than the Radeon R9 280. But does this tiny car succeed where the older Radeon failed? As seen on screen right now, one thing that this tiny Pascal GPU has on its side is support for DirectX feature level 12.1 compared to the 11.1 for the older Radeon. Built on a much smaller 14nm processor, the Nvidia card is rated for a TDP of 75 watts, although I rarely saw it going above 70. As a result, the cooling solution can be a lot smaller without sacrificing either size or temperatures. The solid aluminum block and the two minuscule fans managed to keep the card at 64C in heaven for a delta over ambient of 40C. For now, the card will be occasionally bottlenecked in multiplayer titles by the test system you all know and love, the Z230 workstation with its i7-4770 equivalent Xeon and 32 GB of DDR3 running at 1600 MHz in dual channel. As for single-player titles, we're using now a different approach, where the aim is to find the quality preset that allows the 1% lows to stay at 30 FPS or above. This is also the reason why it's unlikely to get into a platform bottleneck in these games. Speaking of FPS in games, Rainbow Six Siege was tested at low settings in DirectX 12. The average FPS the GTX 1050 Ti gets ranges between 84 at 1080 resolution and 100% render scale and shy of 200 at 720 resolution and 50% render scale. The 1% low stays above 60 FPS even at full 1080 resolution, so no reason to drop the resolution. If you do decide to sacrifice some of it for higher FPS, my advice is to use 1080 and 50% render scale. The upscaler used here is pretty decent, and the 97 FPS for the 1% lows and 128 for the average should do fine. I cheated a bit when testing Doom Eternal and only ran the game at the quality settings that had the previously reviewed card running okay. The performance of the GTX 1050 Ti doesn't wander off too far, with an average FPS in the mid-70s at 1080 low settings and 1600x900 high settings. The 1% lows however stay in the 50s, making 1080 low the preferred choice. Unlike with the R9 280, the finals managed to run just fine this time around. It's also the first game to point at that at low settings. The rest of the test system can't keep up with the GTX 1050 Ti. As seen on screen right now, we get more or less the same average and 1% lows at all three tested resolutions. I still enjoy playing the game and I'm quite curious to see what this little card can do when not platform limited. It's just it won't be in this video. Just like with Doom Eternal, I cheated again when testing Fallout 4. But it all makes sense if you take a look at the results. 30 FPS for the 1% lows in either Diamond City or the outside areas, and 50 to 60 FPS for the average. It doesn't really make sense to drop below 1080 resolution and ultra settings, so there was really no need to test for lower pixel counts or quality presets. I would not trade resolution for FPS in Apex Legends, but I'm sure some of you might find it a good deal. So besides 1080 resolution and low settings, I did capture statistics for 1600x900 at 720 resolutions. The average FPS ranges between 120 at 1080 resolution and 185 at 720. The 1% low sits somewhere between 85 and 124, depending on the selected resolution. Yeah, I cheated a lot in this video. Just like with the previously reviewed card, Shadow of the Tomb Raider will run fine on the GTX 1050 Ti at 1080 resolution and high settings. The average reaches mid-40s and the 1% lows turned out to be 30. The results at lowest settings are there to illustrate the available performance margin, in case there are some more demanding scenes. That margin turns out to be around 50%. Now, the results for Counter-Strike 2 might have you believe that the 1050 Ti is not system bottlenecked. What happened however was that the test run at 720 resolution was not quite the same as the ones for 1080 and 1600x900. In reality, the system will put a lid on the FPS at around 120 FPS. It didn't make sense to test Borderlands 3 at settings lower than medium. At 1080 resolution, the 1% low stayed in the mid-30s and the average in the high 40s. If you want to use high settings, a drop in resolution to 1600x900 might just do it, since the average stays in the mid-30s. The 1% lows are not quite 30 or above, but it should not completely ruin your game experience either. I'm having trouble letting go of XDefiant, despite Ubisoft no longer allowing registration of new players, so I decided to test it while it lasts. The GTX 1050 Ti averaged 121 FPS and provided 75 for the 1% lows, at 1080 resolution and low settings. This number increased as the resolution drops, reaching 204 for the average and 101 for the 1% lows at 720 resolution. Like with the previous card, Resident Evil 4 runs acceptably only at 720 resolution and the performance priority preset. 1600 by 900 is also doable, as long as 28 FPS 41% lows is doable. But even for someone used to low FPS, 1080 resolution might not be the best experience. The two lower resolution options will probably do you better. When testing Fortnite, I decided to forego the OG map and stuck with just the main season map and the reload mode. Rendering the main mode map is somewhat unsurprisingly system bottlenecked, and both the average FPS and the 1% lows stay in a narrow interval around 150 FPS and mid-50s respectively. The map used in Fortnite Reload is smaller, so both metrics increase. The average is, again, the same for all resolutions, at around 200 FPS. The 1% lows shows the same behavior and stays between high 80s and high 90s. This is somewhat smaller than what I got for the previous version of the Reload map, but hey, that comes with the live service deal. Unsurprisingly, for the regulars of the channel, Terminator resistance range is fine at 1080 resolution and epic settings. The average FPS was recorded in the low 50s, while the 1% lows reached 40 FPS. As mentioned before, this is a slow-paced single-player title, and the performance of the Pascal card should be enough. Overwatch 2 has such a low CPU overhead that it manages to remain GPU bottlenecked for all tested resolution and low settings. The average FPS ranges between 194 at 1080 resolution and 368 at 720. The 1% low stays at about 70% of the average, making for a very smooth experience. The 4GB of VRAM on the GTX 1050 Ti might be an issue with Far Cry 6. For all tested resolution and settings, the game showed a red bar for VRAM usage in the game settings page. The CAN benchmark has the average in the low 40s and 1% lows in the low 30s for both 1080 resolution and high settings on one hand, and 1600 by 900 resolution and ultra settings. Lowering the quality to gain more FPS is a viable option, and at 1080 resolution and medium settings, the card now averages 47 FPS and has the 1% lows in the high 30s. I honestly cannot believe my own eyes. After witnessing most cards averaging under 90 FPS in Dota 2, it seems that it is the GTX 1050 Ti that is destined to break the 100 FPS ceiling for the average. The game was tested using a match replay at 1080 resolution and low settings, except for the rendering scale. That one was manually set back to 100. Just like the card we revisited the previous time, I would not attempt increasing the quality settings for control. With everything set to lowest, the card averages 62 FPS at 1080 resolution and the 1% low stays at a comfortable 52. And while low is still an option, medium 1080 has the average tanking to 29 and the 1% lows to 21, which will quickly make this an experience to remember, albeit for the wrong reasons. GTA 5 recommends a set of quality options that are mostly set to very high and high, and at 1080 resolution the GTX 1050 Ti manages an average FPS of 84 and 1% lows of 51. This is already good enough for this game, but to have a common data point with other cards tested on the channel, the card was tested also at 1080 and low settings. The numbers now improved to 126 for the average and 69 for the 1% lows, making this a nice experience at worst. Warframe will have no problem running at 1080 resolution and low settings. Due to a lack of a CAN benchmark or replay functionality, I resorted to playing the same Mariana mission at 1080 resolution. The card averaged 272 FPS and the 1% lows were above 160 FPS. It is difficult not to like this tiny Pascal card. At a power draw that allows it to operate without any external PCI connector, it manages to run quite a good bunch of popular online titles and some of the older AAA single-player games. The price of this card varies quite a bit, sometimes as low as 30 USD, but more recently going above 50. This is in a similar price range as the similarly performing GTX 960. And while the price to performance ratio is the same as with the Maxwell card, the lower power consumption is an advantage, making it a good candidate for the office PC to entry-level gaming PC meta. My i5 2400 can attest to that. Anyway, this is it for this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next.